Congress wasn't doing anything. And why? It couldn't. It had no real power under the Articles of Confederation. It doesn't have any control over trade, and it can't get any money. So what it's doing is nothing. And so the battle between the states, of each state trying to get each other, trying to hurt each other as much as they could, that goes on, and Congress has no way to stop it. And Congress is doing its part to make the situation worse, because Congress also owes a lot of money. Remember, Congress had borrowed money during the war. They had borrowed a lot of money from Americans, and they'd borrowed an approximately equal amount from foreigners, mostly the French, but also Dutch and Spanish and some other foreign lenders who had supported us during the war. Now they're supposed to pay those loans back, and they don't have any money. So that makes it really bad for the rich people in America who had loaned money to Congress and now find that they've got bonds from Congress that are sort of like legal documents attesting to a debt, and the bond spells out that Congress agrees to repay the debt under a certain schedule with interest, and it spells out what the interest is going to be, and Congress is not honoring them. So there's a lot of rich Americans who have, a drawer full of bonds from Congress because they'd been patriotic Americans during the war and had loaned money to Congress at a time when doing that was life-threatening and a very dangerous risk, and they'd done it because they were patriots, and now Congress is repaying them by stiffing them and not repaying the money that they owe. And that creates hardship for people, these are rich people, and supposedly they can afford it. But even if you're a rich person, if you have assets, if you have bonds, that's an asset. That's supposed to be something of value. And things of value are supposed to be producing for you. And they aren't. They're just sitting in the drawer doing nothing. So what many of those rich people have started to do is to sell their bonds and say, well, I got to get some cash out of this. I can't afford to sit on paper that isn't doing me any good. So there's in fact quite a market that develops between buyers and sellers of congressional bonds, of the bonds that Congress had issued during the war as sort of as certificates of debt, a statement that they owe money to somebody. And more people are selling their bonds. Other people are buying them. Obviously, somebody has to buy it. But the basic economics of this is that the supply of bonds was greater than the demand, which means that the price of bonds realistically is going down. Bonds all have a face value. They're worth a certain amount of money on paper, but if you try to take it and actually get that much money, you won't. You'll have to sell it at a loss. So people are selling their bonds. Other people are buying them, but they're buying it without any knowledge of whether it's a good decision or not, because the price just keeps going down. So that's creating a real hardship for some Americans, mostly wealthy people. Most Americans don't have bonds. Most Americans had not loaned money to Congress because they're not in a position to have money to lend. But so it's not very many people that are affected by that. But there are people in this country who are in bad shape because the price of bonds is going down, and that means they're getting poorer. Their wealth is the value of their bonds, but the value is determined by sort of an open market. It's determined by the supply and demand and the going price for the bond, and the price is going down, so people are getting poorer. They're getting less value. in addition to Congress not being able to pay its debts, many states had also borrowed money during the war. Now, talking about state debts is pretty complicated because it's a very mixed bag. States are not in the same position. Every state's a little bit different. Some states during the war had borrowed heavily, and other states had not borrowed as much at all. So when the war ended, some states had big debts and some states did not. And there's states in between. Every state's a little bit different. There's a range from the biggest to the worst. And it's different because states are of different sizes, and so it's very hard to generalize. But we can make a few kind of rough approximations here. And we can say that controlling for size, and so what you do is you look at the debt per population, per capita. If you look at that, you can generally say there are states with heavier debts, with bigger debts, and then there are states that have lesser debts. And the key to that is simple geography as a generalization, and it's a generalization, but as a generalization, northern states have bigger debts than southern states. And the reason is pretty simple. During the war, most of the fighting had been in the north. The war, remember, began in Massachusetts with the Battle of Lexington and Concord. And then your book back in chapter 5 talks about the Battle of Bunker Hill, a key battle that took place in Massachusetts. And all throughout the war, there was a lot of fighting in Massachusetts. Also during the war, President General Washington and the Continental Army spent a lot of their efforts in the north. They tried to drive the British Army out of Boston. They succeeded in that. We did get the British to evacuate the army from Boston, where it had been such a big issue. But the British Army's headquarters had always been in New York, and they did not evacuate from New York. Washington spent much of his effort trying to get the British Army out of New York and failed. So there was a lot of battles. There were several battles up there. You remember the crossing the river and so forth. The famous picture of Washington. The battle, the winter of Valley Forge, which is in Pennsylvania, where the Continental Army suffered so severely. Most of Washington's efforts were in the north, and the militias of the north were much more involved in the war, in the fighting. It was only at the end of the war that the British moved their main armies down to the south, thinking that, correctly, that probably there were more loyalists in the south than in the north, and thinking that they would get more support from the loyalists if they moved their armies down there and relied on allies of the loyalists rather than in the north where there were not very many. But that was near the end of the war, so most of the fighting was in the north, which means that the northern militias were much more involved in the war, and that northern states had to borrow more money to pay for their militias, and so they generally had heavier debts. The three states that had the highest debt in order when the war ended, this is controlling for population, and this is per capita, per population, but the three highest states were Rhode Island, Connecticut, and Massachusetts, three New England states. And it's no coincidence, but the number of casualties that the militias had suffered during the war, the people who had done the most fighting and therefore the most dying during the war were in order in terms of population, were Rhode Island, Connecticut, and Massachusetts. So there's a very close link between the level of fighting and the debt. It doesn't hold up all the way through the 13 states, but it's close enough that we can say that states that had debts, the states with big debt problems, were in the North, less so in the South. And states responded to that debt in certain ways. For southern states, it was easier because they didn't have as big a debt to worry about, as a rule. And I'm overstating things a little bit there to make the point, but it's close enough. Don't make it like it's a black and white thing and good and bad. It's not clear, but as a generalization, southern states have less of a problem paying off their state debts than northern states did. But for northern states, this debt is a very serious problem. They end the war, they owe money. And northern states responded to it differently. Every state responded to their debt differently. But I can pick out two states to look at how they responded to this debt. And let's take two of the big states, Massachusetts and Rhode Island. Two of the states with the biggest debts per capita of all of the country. In Massachusetts, the state legislature was dominated by like Boston bankers, the financial pillars of the state. These are people who took issues like debt very seriously. If you have a debt, you have to pay it back. Well, of course, because it's the rich guys who hold the debt. They're the ones who had loaned the money, so they want to make sure that the state repays its debt. So Massachusetts did a very good job of paying their debts. They have bonds. The bonds stipulate that they're going to pay so much per year. They made sure that they did it. They stayed up to date. They honored their debts. They paid the interest and the principal on those debts. They were really good about maintaining the fiscal responsibility of the state, an issue that they took seriously. To do that, of course, they had to come up with the money. And how does a state come up with money? Well, it imposes taxes. So taxes in Massachusetts were very high because the state's got big debts. It's got to pay off these debts, and so the legislature passes very high taxes. And they set up the taxes so that in general, the people who are going to pay the taxes to a much greater extent are going to be farmers and not city businessmen, not bankers and other people. Because it's the city bankers and rich people who are running the state legislature, and so forth. They're the ones who are kind of determining how the taxes are doing. And they structure taxes, although they paid some taxes themselves, but the heavy burden of taxation fell on farmers. So Massachusetts farmers are really struggling with high taxes necessary to maintain the fiscal responsibility and the obligation of the state to pay its debt. And these are some of the same farmers who are heavily in debt because of the mortgages they took out during the war. So they're paying high taxes, and they have heavy mortgage payments they're supposed to make, and that many of them are not able to make. So for Massachusetts farmers, yeah, the state is maintaining its obligations, it's paying its debts, it's doing the right thing, but it's creating great hardship for the farmers between low prices for their products, heavy debt payments, and now the state comes along and passes very high taxes. I think somebody estimated at one time that a farmer would probably, in order to pay his taxes, with the price of farm goods kind of low and so forth, that a third of his income would go to taxes. That's a big chunk. That's a big, heavy burden of taxation. But the state was responsible. It was doing the right thing. It was paying its debt. Next door is Rhode Island. Well, in Rhode Island, the politics of the state were a little bit different. And it turned out that in Rhode Island, the people in the state who sort of had a control of the legislature, the people who dominated the voting and be able to elect their people to the legislature, were mostly farmers. So that the Rhode Island legislature was really run by the farmers, in contrast to the Massachusetts legislature, which is run by like city bankers. But it's small farmers who have a decisive vote in the state legislature. So Rhode Island has come up with a plan to help their farmers, who's them. Farmers in Rhode Island could get a loan to pay off their debts, to pay off their mortgages. So the state of Rhode Island is lending money to farmers. You might say, well, wait a minute, where are they getting the money? And they're getting the money the easy way. They're printing it. You know, that's simple. You just get a printer and some paper and some ink and you turn out paper. Well, we talked about this in class. We talked about paper money. And everybody knows that there's certain rules, and I hope you got it, that there are rules about paper money. One, it's issued by banks, not the government. And two, it's backed up by gold. That banks have to have gold to secure the paper money that they're printing. And Rhode Island is breaking all the rules. It's the legislature that's printing the money, and what do they have to back it up? Nada. They're just printing money without anything. So what good is that money? Well, everybody knows it's worthless. So the rich people, who are the mortgage holders, they won't take the money. They refuse to accept it. They know it's worthless. It's just paper. It's like monopoly money that the legislature just printed. So the state legislature passed a law in Rhode Island that said you had to accept the paper money. You didn't have it, you couldn't refuse to accept it. So rich people in Rhode Island are literally running out of the state to get away from their debtors who are trying to pay off the mortgages with this worthless money. And if they accept it, if the rich people accept it, they're going to be ruined. They're going to have all this paper money that's worthless. So what the state of Rhode Island is doing is helping its farmers deal with debt, but by issuing paper money, and the state is also using that paper money to pay off its loans, and nobody wants to accept it, it's worthless. Well, what is the state of Rhode Island doing? People loaned it money during the war. They loaned money to farmers, they loaned money to the state, and they loaned real money. They loaned gold. And now the state is going to pay them back, and the farmers are going to be able to pay them back with paper that's worthless. So the people who loaned the gold have lost their gold. They've lost their property. The state government is there to protect property rights. If you remember, that's what states do. That's what governments do. They protect people's rights, life, liberty, and property. And what the state of Rhode Island is doing is little more than stealing their property. They're printing this paper money. Supposedly they're lending it to farmers, and supposedly the farmers are going to pay it back with gold, which will back it up. But everybody knows that farmers are going to get these loans and just forget about it. So the state is literally stealing money. And the rich people of Rhode Island look at this, and I mean, they're trying to get out of the state because they're facing disaster. And what we've got then is a state that is not protecting property rights, it's stealing them. So in Rhode Island, the rich people are really hurting. In Massachusetts, the farmers are really hurting, but people are hurting. And that's just all throughout the country in various ways. People are hurting. So many of these rich people are going to start communicating among themselves